However, he is donating all the royalties from the sale of those books to the Friends of the Virginia Beach Library. So with that, I've ended all the housekeeping and all the welcomes. Sit back and enjoy yourself. And I would like to introduce one of our best teen volunteers without whom we could not do the Friends of the Library book sale. His name is Kelly Powell. He also is very active at the Bayside Area Library. And I asked him what it was he wanted me to tell 4,000 people about himself. And other than being my book sale honcho on the spot, who always reminds me we better save boxes for the leftovers, Kelly goes to Lynn Haven Junior High and now terrorizes the Great Neck Area Library staff on a regular basis. And he asked me to say that he is senior patrol leader and life scout in Boy Scout Troop number 60, if any of his friends are here. And Kelly will introduce Stephen King.
Thank you, Mary Kay. Nice speech. Our guest tonight, Stephen King, is no stranger to most of you. He's taken all of us on some very peculiar trips to a place called Castle Rock on many occasions. It's not a place you want to visit for fun all by yourself, but somehow you get a kick out of it when you go with him. There's probably nobody here who sees a fog without thinking about being trapped in a supermarket in the mist with Stephen King. I'll bet some of you look at your car a little funny after riding in Christine with Stephen King, and nobody wants to sit with Grandma after meeting Stephen King's. And prom night is just fine without Carrie. Let Stephen King be her date. And just hope when you die of possible mysterious causes that somebody can pay for your funeral with a MasterCard like Stephen King did in Pet Sematary. He's not exactly unforgettable, this Stephen King. Unfortunately, some people don't think the rest of us should read him. Stephen King's books have been banned in the following places: Las Vegas, Nevada, 1975. Carrie challenged at the Clark High School Library as, quote, trash, unquote. Vergennes, Vermont, 1978. Carrie was placed on a special closed shelf in the high school library because it could, quote, harm students, especially young girls, end quote. Rankin County, Mississippi, 1984. Cujo challenged because it was considered, quote, profane and sexually objectionable, end quote. Bradford, New York, 1984. Cujo was removed from the shelves of the school library, quote, because it was a bunch of garbage, end quote. Campbell County, Wyoming, 1984. Firestarter was challenged because it's alleged, quote, vulgar language and violence, end quote. The Shining was also challenged because, quote, the story contains violence, demonic possessions, and ridicules the Christian religion, end quote. Washington County, Alabama, 1985. Christine was banned from all high school libraries because the book contained, quote, unacceptable language, end quote, and was considered, quote, pornographic, end quote. Hayward, California, 1985. Cujo was rejected for the purchase for school libraries because of the, quote, rough language and explicit sex scenes. Vancouver, Washington, 1986. The Shining was removed from 4 junior high school libraries because the book's, quote, descriptive foul language, end quote, made it unsuitable for teenagers. Stephen King gives new meaning to the old phrase about, quote, if you're not controversial, you have nothing to offer, end quote. So it is especially appropriate that he is the Friends of the Library's featured speaker for the Banned Books Week 1986. This event proclaims his right to write the books that he wants to write, and our right to read them if we choose, and obviously a great many of us do so choose, despite those who would like to keep us from doing so. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the contemporary master of horror fantasy, Stephen King.
Thank you. I want to tell you, that's the most uplifting introduction I've ever had. Think of all those places that I've been banned and everything like that. I always sort of wanted to start one of these things by coming up and saying, "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash," but I guess I can't do that now. Monologue. I do have sort of a strep throat, but I brought a little vitamin B along with me so that I can take care of the problem. How many of you are sort of bored with banned books and the whole discussion on banned books? Yeah. Me too. Me too. I don't go out on purpose to talk about it, and I'm not going to talk about it too long tonight. I don't lecture, you know, because I don't really know how, and I don't make speeches because I don't know how to do that. What I do is sort of let my jaw fall open, and it runs by itself. See, I used to be a high school teacher, and it's sort of like Pavlov's dogs. The bell rings, and your jaw falls open, and you continue to talk until another bell rings, so you guys could be here all night if somebody doesn't ring a bell. But I wanted to tell you a couple of stories about books and the sort of situation that you get into with controversial material, or material that some people consider to be controversial. The first thing happened just after I'd published Salem's Lot, which was well received by my relatives, and not too many other people. This was just before the movie of Carrie came out, and made me sort of a household name like Spiro Agnew. Pardon me. But I went and I spoke to a ladies group. You don't mind, do you? Thank you. Those are called Irish vitamins. Anyway, I went to a ladies' reading group in Western Maine, where I spoke for a while. I ran my jaw for a while, and then I asked for questions, and a lady who was about, I would say 65 going on 800 stood up and said, "Well, you know, I liked that story, but I didn't like all that foul language. And I don't know any reason for anyone to tell a good story with all that foul language in it." And I said, well, think of it this way. Think of the way guys talk in the barbershop when there's just a bunch of guys on Saturday morning. And she said, well, I've been in the barbershop on Saturday morning, and they don't talk that way. And I said, "Madam, I am writing about the Saturday mornings you didn't come." I've written a lot of stories about desperate people and desperate situations, and you know, it gets down to a point where you say to yourself, here's a guy who's building something in his garage, and he's all by himself, and he's hammering a nail into a board, and he misses that nail, and he hits his thumb instead, and blood squirts out and everything. Now, does this guy say, "Oh, pickles"? Use your imagination. In other words, you know, what I'm talking about is telling the truth. Tell the truth, tell the truth. Frank Norris, who wrote The Pit, and he wrote, McTeague and a number of other naturalistic novels that were banned in a lot of places, said, "I don't fear, I don't apologize, because I know in my heart that I never lied, I never truckled. I told the truth." And I think that the real truth of fiction is that fiction is the truth. Moral fiction is the truth inside the lie. And if you lie in your fiction, you are immoral, and you have no business doing it at all. Of course, the other story about banned books and everything. Well, I did a film called Creepshow a few years ago. I played a part, got to turn into a... Hey! Somebody remembered that one. All right. I actually got to play a part in that. I had done a thing for George Romero earlier, a little bit part in a film called Night Riders, where I played a redneck, and he must have figured I gave good neck, because he offered me the part of Jordy Verrill, where I got to play this farmer who turns into a human weed. And I also did the screenplay, and when the film was in post-production, there was a controversy in the Pittsburgh school system. There was a kid who had been assigned to do a term paper on work, and he picked the steelworking industry. And a book that he took out of the school library was a book called Working by Studs Terkel. Now, the way that Studs Terkel does books is he sits in bars with working guys after they get off work, and his great genius is he turns on the tape recorder, and he doesn't ask many questions. He just lets them rap on about what they do. And of course, steel workers, you know, are the same as the guy who is missing the nail with a hammer, and he doesn't say, "Oh, pickles." They used a number of words that the lady would have heard on those days. She wasn't in the barber shop, and they were all in the book. Well, his mother saw the book and took it and read it, and was horrified by some of the language. There were words that rhyme with shock, and words that rhyme with, never mind. You know those words. George Carlin calls them the 7 words that you can't say on TV and all that other stuff. But she was horrified, and she demanded that the book be taken out of the Pittsburgh school system, that it be banned because it would be harmful to high school kids to read those books. They might read those words and their eyes might turn to jelly and run down their faces, or possibly by reading those words they might be incited to go out and rape women, children, porcupines, who knows, anything that moves, because you know how impressionable teenagers are. They can't be trusted to do anything. Totally useless human beings who will do anything that their friends tell them to do, so they can't have things like that. Give them little golden books, and they'll grow up to be responsible adults capable of facing the world. So it went to the school board, and there was a protracted fight, after which Working by Studs Terkel was actually taken for a time out of the Pittsburgh school system. But the real kicker to the story was when the kid who had to do the report took the book out, there was one stamp in that book. It was his. It had been in the library for 3 years, and nobody had taken it out. By the time that the school board decided to remove the book, there were 63 stamps in that book. Which reminds me of when I was a kid, and there was this book called Peyton Place. You didn't have to find the naughty parts. The books just fell open. And they were there. They were there. I was involved with an anti-obscenity referendum in Maine. The referendum question was very simple, very simply stated. Do you want to make it a crime to sell or vend obscene material? And so this is sort of like saying, do you want to make it a crime to kill Santa Claus? Most people said, well, of course, but when they went in there to the voting booths, I think that they thought a little bit different, and I'm happy to say that the referendum was voted down 70% to 30% by the people who voted, because they realized that obscene is one of those words that exists in the eye of the beholder. What's obscene? What's not obscene? What's bad? What's not bad? What's moral? What's immoral? Well, we live in a democracy. We live in a place where, within limits, free will is supposed to reign. Democracy is a two-edged sword, which is to say, there are all sorts of rock-ribbed Republicans and conservatives who argue that they'll take the gun from my hands when they pry my cold dead fingers from it, you know. Okay, that's fine. And there are people who say, well, you can't make me wear a motorcycle helmet when I ride because it's my God-given right to ride any way that I want. It's not your business to tell me how to ride. And man, I love that law. We have a no-helmet law in Maine. And as far as I'm concerned, it gets a lot of the dreck out of the gene pool because these guys hit the wall, boom, they're gone, baby. If they're not smart enough to wear a helmet, all right, screw them, they're gone. They won't have a lot of kids to be out on welfare and all this other stuff. But, okay, we understand that democracy is a two-edged sword. If you give people the right to have guns, sooner or later somebody's going to get gut hold. And we understand that if you give people the right to ride without a helmet, sooner or later somebody's brains are going to get turned into something that looks like what's in a Mixmaster or something like that. But for a lot of conservatives and fundamentalists, there is a point up the blade of democracy where that double edge becomes a single edge. And that point always occurs when their own personal sensibilities are offended. The greatest offenders are fundamentalist preachers and teachers. There are people like Jimmy Swaggart and Pat Robertson who, if they could jump into a time machine and go back to the Garden of Eden, would point up and say, God, you got this tree, it's the tree of good and evil. Now you're going to put a barbed wire fence around it right now. Okay? Well, God didn't put any barbed wire fence around it. Jesus said, render unto Caesar those things that belong to Caesar, and render unto God those things that belong to God. And as far as I'm concerned, they can keep their nose out of what I read. Okay? Don't tell me I can't have a gun if I'm a moral, upright citizen. Don't tell me I have to wear a mouth guard when I ride my motorcycle, which was a law that existed for a while in California. And don't tell me what goes on the shelves in my living room. I think that a lot of these people don't realize that the sewer material that so offends them is such a small percentage of the total sale of all material that these people go in and out of business all the time. It's not the problem that they see it as. It's built up, and that's about all that I want to say about it, because it's really sort of boring. I would like to say one other thing, and that it has to do with public school libraries. Okay, because when you deal with public school libraries, and this is particularly aimed at those of you who are now in the public schools, okay, they are in a situation called in loco parentis, which means that they have to adhere very carefully to the idea that they are the parent. And if there's a consensus that decides that a book should be taken out of a library, I believe they should take that book out. I have no problem with that at all. If they take Cujo or Salem's Lot or The Shining out of a public school library somewhere in New York or Vermont or something, or if they take Working out of the Pittsburgh system or something like that, fine. I have no problem with that. I would just say to you, as students who are supposed to be learning, as soon as that book is gone from the library, do not walk, run to your nearest public library or bookseller and find out what your elders don't want you to know, because that's what you need to know. Okay? Don't let them bullshit you, and don't let them, guide your mind, because once that starts, it never stops. Some of our most famous world leaders have been book banners, including Hitler and Stalin and Idi Amin, and people like that need to be thought about. Anyway, enough about banned books and all that stuff. I want to read to you from a piece of a novel called Misery that's forthcoming. And before I read this piece, which sort of bears on the subject, you'll see why. I have to describe the situation because Would you like me to pose this one wrong? Remember, it wouldn't be this if it wasn't the strep throat. I'm dying up here. I have to have it. But I can stop anytime I want to. It's no problem. What I write, when I write horror stories, a lot of times are not exactly novels at all. They're sort of like situation comedies, except with a twist going the other way. I like to tell people the difference between humor and horror is it stops being humor when it starts being you. You know, you can laugh your head off when some guy slips on a banana peel, unless you're the one who does it, and you bite down on your tongue, and the end of it comes out and lands on your lap, and you say, oh no, this isn't so funny. And some guy laughs at you, and you want to go over and clock the bastard, right? So, a lot of what I've written has been sort of situation horror. That's what I think of it. I mean, for instance, you take a book like The Shining. I could easily see cast in the parts of Jack and Wendy Torrance, Lucy and Desi Arnaz. You know, Lucy, I'm home! I mean, imagine those guys. You know that he sort of hates her guts, and in the right situation, you know, isolated and everything, something like that could happen. It's possible. So, does that make any sense? Yes, I think it does. So anyway, this book is about fans. Particularly, it's about #1 fans. I've been thinking about #1 fans for a long time because I get a lot of mail, and it's a lot of it signed, "Your #1 fan." And when I was at doing the Tomorrow Show at Rockefeller Plaza in New York about, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, you come down, and at 30 Rockefeller, the most important thing to know when you're done is where your car is, because there are these autograph people that wait for you. And in some cases, they're just autograph collectors. In other cases, their eyes are sort of empty and they're just sort of weird. They don't know why they want that autograph. They just know that you're somebody who is on TV. You are projected through the air, which makes you somebody who's not really real, but sort of a celebrity or something. And then there are other people whose eyes are not only sort of empty, but they look sort of like haunted houses that say, not only is nobody home, the place is haunted. And this guy was one of those, and he was this sort of thin, willowy guy, and he's clutching at me and saying, will you sign this, will you sign this? And he had a piece of paper, and I signed it. And I'm going for the limousine, and he's, my picture taken with you? Can I get my picture taken with you? And I said, yeah, real quick. And he gives the camera to somebody, and he gets the Polaroid, and while it's developing, he says, will you sign it? Will you sign it? And I said, yeah, and then that's the end. And he's got the special pen. You know he's been there before, because it's almost impossible to write on a Polaroid. Everything beads up, but this one special pen, so he's got that. And I sign it, best wishes to Mark Chapman from Stephen King. It was the guy who killed John Lennon. And in the course of our discussion, he described himself as my #1 fan. So, every time I take some of that, those things go off. Anyway, I decided to write a book about a guy named Paul Sheldon, who is a novelist, who writes 2 kinds of novels. He has written a number of bestsellers that are sort of like bodice rippers. Do you know what bodice rippers are? They're sort of like My Savage Zip Code and Rip My Flesh and things like that. They're the ones that you see in the paperback racks where the guy and the gal are sort of embraced, and almost everything is sort of like hanging out, but not quite. And his hand is always like 1 centimeter below the lady's breast. It's always just, it's close, but no cigar. Anyway. So Misery is the character that Paul Sheldon writes about, and he's written 5 misery books about this woman, Misery Chastain, who was born an orphan. I told you it was a situation horror story. You gotta get, you know, cool to this. It's like a Shaggy Dog story a little bit, except it doesn't have a punchline. Well, it sort of does. Why am I saying this? This is all parenthetical. Anyway, he's gotten more and more sick of his major character, who is an orphan who has risen to marry a peer of the realm and all the rest of it. And these books have been fabulously successful, but he sort of despises them because he thinks of himself as a serious novelist. So while he's writing these books, he's written a number of other books which he thinks of as serious literature. And in the fifth Misery novel, which is called Misery's Child, he has killed Misery off at the end. He's finally taken the step. She dies during childbirth. Well, meanwhile, while all this is going on, there's a woman out there who is Paul Sheldon's #1 fan, and her name is Annie Wilkes, and she is a deep psychotic. She is a registered nurse who has killed about 119 people. She has started with children who are born who are cataclysmically deformed or, in some way that they're going to die anyway, and she's progressed slowly to geriatrics who don't look like they have much of a chance, to injured people, to heart attack victims, and finally to almost anybody she can get hold of. And the only way that she escapes the law is because she is extremely clever, as some psychotics are. And she has continued to move steadily westward from her beginnings until she reaches a place that's very near the Overlook Hotel on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, where she has a place. She has finally been brought to book in a Denver courtroom for the murder of 12 infants in a Denver hospital, of which she was the chief nurse of pediatrics. And she's escaped by the skin of her teeth. And all this time she's been reading and relishing the trials and tribulations of Misery Chastain, and thinking that the author of these books, Paul Sheldon, is the most wonderful person in the world. Well, Paul Sheldon makes it his business to finish all his novels in Boulder, Colorado, which is not too far from where Annie lives, and he's finished a mainstream novel called Fast Cars, which has nothing to do with Misery, since Misery's dead. And when he's done with the book, he thinks it's the best thing he's ever written. It's a piece of crap, by the way. Oh, it's an awful book. But he gets a little bit drunk on champagne and decides that he's going to drive to Los Angeles in his Camaro. Well, there's a snowstorm, and he has a second bottle of champagne, and the last thing that he remembers is that he's reaching for his cigarettes, and the car turns over and over. His lower legs are crushed entirely. His left knee is pulverized. His pelvis is dislocated in a blizzard that's developing. And who should come along back from town but Annie Wilkes, who has been down there specifically for one reason: to look for Misery's Child. The hardcover has been out for a long time, but she is one of those people who is waiting for the paperback. Do you know those people? I read your last book, but I'm waiting for the paperback. Yes. So she doesn't know that Misery is dead, but she sees a wreck and she goes down and she pulls the guy out and realizes that she has discovered her favorite author. And so Annie Wilkes, this psychotic nurse who is Paul Sheldon's #1 fan, takes him back to her place, hooks him on dope for his pain, and tells him that she is going to write him a book about her heroine just for her Misery, without knowing that Misery is dead. Oh, I love it. I still love it. Anyway, so Paul is unable to get out of bed, and he's racked with pain, and he's also hooked, because in between killing people, Annie has been stealing every drug in sight that she can possibly get her hands on, including some pretty heavy-duty caca. I can't say shit because, you know, we might get in trouble here. Anyway, so we pick up at the point where Annie has finally gotten the paperback, and she's just finished it and realized what's happened. Keep this in mind and think a little bit about the most radical book banning you can imagine. Okay. Because one of the things that she salvaged is the only copy of Paul's manuscript of his new book, Fast Cars, contemporary book. Annie came in the following afternoon, her face a deathly white. Paul had been dozing, but he came awake at once, jerking up on his elbows. "Miss Wilkes, are you all right?" "No." "Christ, she's had a heart attack," he thought, and there was a moment's alarm which was immediately replaced by joy. Let her have one. Let her have a big one. Let her have a chest burster. He would be more than happy to crawl to the telephone, no matter how much it might hurt. He would crawl to the telephone over broken glass if that was what it took. And it was a heart attack. It just wasn't the right kind. She came toward him, not quite staggering, but rolling the way a sailor will when he's just gotten off his ship at the end of a long voyage. "What?" He tried to shrink away from her, but there was no place to go. There was only the headboard, and behind that, the wall. "No." She reached the side of the bed, bumped it, wavered, and for a moment seemed on the verge of falling on top of him. Then she just stood there, looking down at him out of her paper-white face, the cords of her neck standing out, one vein pulsing in the center of her forehead. Her hands snapped open, hooked shut into solid rock-like fists, and then snapped open again. You dirty bird." "What? I don't..." But suddenly he did, and his entire midsection first seemed to turn hollow and then to entirely disappear. He remembered where her bookmark had been in the paperback last night, 3/4 of the way through. She'd finished it in the meantime. She knew all there was to know. She knew that misery hadn't been the barren one after all. It had been Ian, her husband. She had sat there in her as yet unseen by him parlor, with her mouth open and her eyes wide as misery finally realized the truth and made her decision and sneaked off to Jeffrey. Had her eyes filled with tears when she realized that misery and Jeffrey, far from having a clandestine affair behind the back of the man they both loved, were trying to give him the greatest gift they could, the gift of the child he would believe to be his own? And had her heart risen when misery told Ian she was pregnant, and Ian had crushed her to his breast, tears flowing from his eyes, muttering, "My dear, oh my dear," over and over again? He was sure in those few seconds that all of those things had happened, but instead of weeping with exalted grief, as she should have done when misery expired giving birth to the boy whom Ian and Jeffrey would presumably raise together, she was mad as hell. "She can't be dead!" Annie Wilkes shrieked at him. Her hands snapped open and hooked closed in a faster and faster rhythm. "Misery Chastain cannot be dead!" Annie, please." There was a glass water pitcher on the table. She seized it up and brandished it at him. Cold water splashed his face. An ice cube landed beside his left ear and slid down the pillow into the hollow of his shoulder. In his mind, he saw her bringing the pitcher down into his face. He saw himself dying of a fractured skull and a massive cerebral hemorrhage in a freezing flood of ice water while goose pimples formed on his arms. She wanted to do it. There was no question of that. She really wanted to do it. At the very last moment, she pivoted away from him and flung the water pitcher at the door instead, where it shattered. She looked back at him and brushed her gray-streaked hair away from her face. I get into it so much. Two hard little spots of red had bloomed in the white with the backs of her hands. "Dirty bird," she panted. "Oh, you dirty birdie, how could you?" He spoke rapidly, urgently, eyes flashing, riveted on her face. He was positive that in a moment his life might depend on what he was able to say in the next 20 seconds. Annie, in 1871, women frequently died in childbirth. Misery gave her life for her husband and her best friend and her child. The spirit of misery will always... "I don't want her spirit," she screamed, hooking her fingers into claws and shaking them at them as if she would tear his eyes out. "I want her! You killed her! You murdered her!" Her hands snapped shut into fists again, and she drove them down like pistons, one on either side of his head. They punched deep into the pillow, and he bounced like a rag doll. His legs flared with pain, and he cried out. "I didn't kill her!" he screamed. She froze, staring at him with a narrow black expression. "Of course not," she said. "And if you didn't, Paul Sheldon, who did?" "No one," he said more quietly. "She just died." Ultimately, he knew this to be the truth. If Misery Chastain had been a real person, he knew he might very well have been called to aid the police in their inquiries, as the euphemism went. After all, he'd had a motive. He'd hated her. He'd hated her since the third book. She had died a mostly unexpected death in spite of that. It had been a part of the plot. His cheerful capering around after she was finally dead had in no way changed the fact. "You lie," Annie whispered. "I thought you were good, but you are not good. You are just a lying old cock-a-doodle dirty birdie." Paul said, "She slipped away, that's all. Sometimes that happens. It was like life, when someone just..." She overturned the table by the bed. The one shallow drawer spilled out. His wristwatch and pocket chain spilled out with it. He had never known they were there. He cringed back from her. "You must think I was born yesterday," she said. Her lips drew back from her teeth. "In my job as a nurse, I saw dozens of people die. Hundreds, now that I think about it. Yes. Sometimes they go screaming, and sometimes they go in their sleep, and sometimes they slip away, just the way you said, sure. But characters in books do not just slip away. God takes us when he thinks it's time, and a writer is God to the people in his story. He made them up just like God made us up. And no one can get hold of God to make him explain. All right, okay. But as far as Misery Chastain goes, I'll tell you one thing, you dirty bird. I'll tell you that God just happens to have a couple of broken legs, and God just happens to be in my house, and God just happens to be eating my food, and she just went blank then. She just went blank. After a while, she came back, a little at a time, and the anger, at least, was gone. She looked down at him sadly. "I think I better go now, Paul. I think I ought to go. Be better if I wasn't around you for a while. I don't think it's wise." "Go? Go where?" "Oh, it doesn't matter. A place I know. If I stay here, I'll do something bad. I've done bad things before. I think I need to go away. Goodbye, Paul." She rose and strode across the room. "Will you be back to give me my medication?" he asked, alarmed. She grasped the doorknob and pulled the key shut without answering. For the first time, he heard the rattle of a key as the door locked. He heard her footsteps going off down the hall. He winced and cried out angrily. There were words that he couldn't understand from outside, and something fell and shattered in the parlor. A door slammed. An engine cranked over and then started up. The low, crunching squeal of tires turned. Now the motor sound began to go away. It dwindled to a drone and was gone. He was alone. Alone in Annie Wilkes's house. He was alone, locked in this room, locked in this bed. He lay there, looking at the ceiling, his heart beating fast. 61 hours. 61 hours. He knew just how long because of the pen, the Flair fineliner he'd been carrying in his pocket at the time of the crash. He'd been able to reach down and snag it. Every time the clock chimed, he made a mark on his arm, 4 vertical marks and a diagonal slash to seal the quintic. When she came back, there were 12 groups of 5 and 1 extra. The first little groups grew increasingly jagged as his hands began to tremble. He didn't believe he missed a single hour. He had dozed but never really slept. The chiming of the clock woke him each time the hour came around. After a while, he began to feel hunger and thirst, even through the pain. It was something like a horse race. At first, King of Pain was far in the lead of I Got the Hongries. I Got the Hongries was about 12 furlongs back. Purty Thirsty was the third horse, but that was lost in the dust. Then around sunup of the day after she left, I Got the Hongries actually gave King of Pain a brief run for his money. He spent much of the night alternately dozing and waking in a cold sweat, sure he was dying. After a while, he began to hope that he was dying. So he just lies there and suffers and suffers and suffers and suffers and suffers. And then he's imagining her dead and every other sort of thing. When she came back in, at first, he thought that she must just be a dream, but then reality, or mere brute survival, took over, and he began to moan and beg and plead, all of it broken, all of it coming from a deepening well of unreality. The one thing he saw clearly was that she was wearing a dark blue dress and a sprigged hat. Her color was high and her eyes sparkled with life and vivacity. She was as close to pretty as Annie Wilkes ever could be. And when he tried to remember that scene later, he could only imagine her flushed cheeks and her sprigged hat. In her hand, she held a glass of water, a tall, cool glass of water. "Take this," she said, and put a hand still cool from the outer doors to the back of his neck so he could drink without choking. He took 3 fast mouthfuls, the pores on the arid plain of his tongue widening and clamoring at the shock of the water, some of it spilling down his chin and onto the t-shirt he wore, and then she drew away from him. He mewed for it, holding his shaking hands out. "No," she said. "No, Paul. A little bit of time, or you'll vomit. You'll go uck, Paul." After a bit, she allowed him 2 more swallows. "The stuff," he said, coughing. He sucked at his lips and ran his tongue over them and sucked at his tongue. He could vaguely remember the stuff, how he needed it. "The capsules, pain. Please, Annie, please, for God's sakes, help me. The pain is so bad." "I know it is, but you must listen to me," she said, looking at him with that stern yet maternal expression. "I had to get away and think. I thought deeply, and I hope I thought well. I was not entirely sure. My thoughts are often muddy, and I know that. I accept that. It's why I couldn't remember where I was all those times they kept asking me about, those times when I was bad. So I prayed. There is a God, you know, Paul, and he answers prayers. He always does. So I prayed. I said, 'Dear God, Paul Sheldon may be dead when I get back.' But God said, 'He will not be. I have spared him, so you may show him the way he must go,'" except she said, "show shoe." During all this, she looked at him benignly. "I will give you your medication, and I will relieve your pain," she said. "But first, you have to do a job. I'll be right back." She got up and headed for the door. "No!" he screamed. She took no notice. He laid in bed, cocooned in pain, trying not to moan and moaning anyway. At first, he thought he'd lapsed into delirium. What he was seeing was too bizarre to be sane. When Annie returned, she was pushing a charcoal grill in front of her. "Annie, I'm in terrible pain." Tears coursed down his cheeks. "I know, my dear." She kissed his cheek, the touch of her lips as gentle as the fall of a feather. "Soon." She left, and he looked stupidly at the charcoal grill, something meant for an outdoor summer patio, which now stood in his room, calling up relentless images of idols and sacrifices. And sacrifice was what she had in mind, of course. When she came back, she was carrying the manuscript of Fast Cars, the only existing result of his year's work, in one hand. In the other hand, she held a package of diamond blue-tip matches. "No," he said, crying and shaking. One thought burned at him like acid. For less than $100, he could have had the manuscript photocopied. Well, he had always thought that was a jinx thing to do. A jinx and a natural disaster all rolled up into one. And here that was. Here was Hurricane Annie. In her innocence, it had apparently never even crossed her mind that there might be a duplicate. "Yes," she said, holding the matches out to him. The manuscript, clean white bond paper, lay on her lap. Her face was clear and calm. "No," he said, turning his burning face away from her. "Yes, this is a filthy book, Paul. Also, it's no good." "You wouldn't know good if it walked up and bit your nose off," he yelled, not caring. She laughed gently. Her temper had apparently gone on vacation. But Paul thought, knowing Annie Wilkes, it could arrive back unexpectedly at any moment, bags in hand. "Hey, couldn't stay away. How you doing?" "First of all," she said, "good would not bite my nose off. Evil might, but not good. Second of all, I do know good when I see it. You were good, Paul. You were good. All you need is a little help. Now take the matches." He shook his head stiffly back and forth. "No." "Yes." "No." "Yes." "No, God damn it!" "Use all the profanity you want, Paul. I've heard it all before." "I won't do it." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, she was holding a cardboard square with the word novel printed across the top in blue letters. Sample, the red letters just below the trade name read, not to be dispensed without a physician's prescription. Below the warning were 4 capsules in blister packs. He grabbed. She pulled it up. "When you burn it," she said, "when you burn it, I'll give you the capsules, all 4, and your pain will go away. You'll begin to feel serene again, and when you've got a hold of yourself, I will change your bedding. I see you've wet it, and it may be uncomfortable. I know it is, and I'll change you, and by then you'll be hungry, and I'll give you some soup. Yes, I'll give you some soup and some unbuttered toast, but until you burn this nasty book, Paul, I can't do anything. I'm sorry." His tone wanted to say, "Yes, yes, okay," so he bit it. He rolled away from her again. "You're the devil," he said. Again, he expected rage and got the indulgent laugh. "Oh, yes, yes. That's what a child thinks when Mummy comes into the kitchen and sees the child playing with cleaning fluid under the sink. He doesn't say it that way, of course, because he doesn't have your education. He just says, 'Mommy, you're mean.'" Her hand brushed her hair away from her hot brow. The fingers trailed down his cheek and across the side of his neck and then squeezed his shoulder briefly with deep emotion and love before drawing away. The mother feels badly when her child says she's mean, or if he cries for what's been taken away, the same way that you're crying right now, Paul. But she knows she's right, so she does her duty, and I'm doing my duty. 3 quick, dull thumps as Annie dropped her knuckles on the manuscript. 190,000 words and 5 lives that a well and pain-free Paul Sheldon had cared deeply about. 190,000 words and 5 lives that he was finding more dispensable as each second passed. The pills, the pills. He had to have the goddamn pills. "Paul?" "No!" he sobbed. "Paul!" The faint rattle of the capsules in their blisters, almost, and then the woody shuffle of the matches in their box. "Paul? Paul? No! I'm waiting, Paul. Paul, I'm waiting. I can wait all day, although I rather suspect that you may go into a coma before too long. I believe you're in a near comatose state now, and I have had a lot of experience." Her voice droned away. "Yes," he thought, "give me the matches, give me a blowtorch, give me a baby Huey and a load of napalm. I'll drop a tactical nuke on it if that's what you want, you goddamn beldame." So spoke the opportunist, the survivor. Yet another part, falling now, near comatose itself, went wailing into the darkness. 190,000 words, 5 lives, a year's work, my freedom. And what was the real bottom line? What was the truth? The truth was you wrote about what you knew about the truth, and no one had the right to make you burn it. There was a creak of bed springs as she stood up. "Well, you're a very stubborn little boy, I must say, and I can't sit by your bed all night as much as I might like to. After all, I've been gone for almost 20 days, for 24 hours, hurrying, and I've been hurrying to get back from here. I'll drop by in a bit and see if you've changed your knot." "You burn it then," he yelled at her. She turned and looked at him. "No," she said, "I cannot do that, as much as I would like to, and spare you the pain you feel." "Why not?" "Because," she said primly, "you must do this of your own free will." He began to laugh then, and her face darkened for the first time since she had come back, and she left the room with the manuscript under her arm. When she came back an hour later, he took the matches. She laid the title page on the grill. He tried to light one of the blue tips and couldn't because it kept missing the rough strip or falling out of his hand. He was that weak. So Annie took the box and lit the match and put the lit match in his hand, and he touched it to the corner of the paper and let the match fall into the pot of the barbecue. And he watched, fascinated, as the flame tasted, then gulped. She had a barbecue fork with her all the time, and when the paper began to curl up, she poked it through the gapes in the grill. "This is going to take forever," he said. "I can't." "No, we'll make quick work of it," she said, "but you must burn a few of the single pages, Paul, as a symbol of your understanding." She now laid the first page of Fast Cars onto the grill, words he remembered writing some 14 months ago in the New York townhouse. "I don't have no wheels," Tony Bonacero said, walking up to the girl coming down the steps, "and I'm a slow learner, but baby, I'm a fast driver." Oh, it brought back the day like the right golden oldie on the radio. He remembered walking around the apartment from room to room, big with book, pregnant with book, more than pregnant, gravid, and here were the labor pains. He remembered finding one of Joan's bras under a sofa cushion earlier in the day, and she'd been gone a full 3 months. Shows you what kind of a job the cleaning service did. He remembered hearing the New York traffic, and faintly the monotonous tolling of a Salvation Santa's bell. He remembered sitting down. As always, the blessed relief of starting, a feeling that was like falling into a hole filled with bright light. He remembered, as always, the glum knowledge that he would not write as well as he wanted to write. As always, the terror of not being able to finish, of just simply accelerating into a blank wall. And as always, the marvelous, joyful, nervy feeling of journey begun. He looked at Annie Wilkes and said clearly, but not loud, "Annie, please, please don't make me do this." She held the matches immovably before him and said, "Paul, you can do as you choose." So he burned his book. Okay, my way of lecturing is not so much to lecture as to answer questions or to talk about things that I've been asked before. And having read as long as I have, let's see, 8:59. Did you guys pay to get in here? Was it free? If it was free, I don't exactly have to sing and dance. And if you get Fanny for tea, you can always leave. Probably not supposed to do this either. Drugs and sex and rock and roll. We'll keep you young forever. Let's see. Let me see what questions I'm most frequently asked. Where do you get your ideas? The answer is I don't really know. They come. I had a great one today. Do I want to go into this? I want to hear this again? Never mind. It's about, well, never mind. A good idea, though. But if I tell it, I probably won't write it down. Let's see, what else do people ask me? How does it feel to be famous? No different than anybody else, except when you're at things like this and you see everybody looking at you, and then it's a little bit strange. One of the odd things that happens about being famous is that you learn to button your fly always, or to zip it, because people say, "That's Stephen King and his flies." No! You know, which is always a good time. Hey, we have a box for me to dump my ashes in, start a fire. Actually, those are questions which I will answer in a minute. Let's see, maybe I can dump a couple of the other ones. The story about being famous is, of course, the famous Pittsburgh story. I don't know if you've heard this or not, but I'll give you the abbreviated version. The first tour that I ever did for a book was for The Shining, which Doubleday decided to push. And I went on an author tour, which means that you do everything in a city that gives you media. And the last thing that I did was a banquet dinner along with Julius Pfeiffer and Bernard Gill and a couple of other writers, and somebody said, well, let's go and get drunk after it was all over, which sounded like a very sensible idea at the time, because when you sit up on a stage and know that you have to make a speech and 2,000 people are watching you eat chicken and seeing which fork you use, it's a little bit unsettling. So we went up to a sort of bar that was way up on top of a mountain, which Pittsburghians call the Incline, which you get to by a cog railroad. And I started to feel what's politely called Montezuma's revenge. And a real sort of earthquake was going on inside me. And I excused myself and I ran into the gentleman's facility. And I mean, this was really a fantastic place. It was gold and marble and everything. And there was a bathroom attendant who was 800 years old, who had bald skull with veins pulsing. You know what I'm talking about. And with a towel over his arm and a couple of quarters in a dish to show you what you were supposed to do in case you were unlettered. And the only thing that this ornate bathroom didn't have were doors on the stalls, but I was past caring, at that point. I mean, the situation had reached the red line. So I rushed in, and I never felt more sorry for myself in my entire life. I'd been away from home for a week, and I was homesick, and I was sick in physically sick, and I thought that things could not get any worse. 800-year-old black man approaches me with a silver pen in his hand and says, "Aren't you Stephen King? My mother saw you on the morning show. She loves all your books. Could I have your autograph for her?" So there I sat with my jeans around my ankles giving this guy an autograph, and what a good time it was. And that's what it's like to be famous. Now let me see. Well, let's reach into the box and see if we have any lotto winners. This ought to be enough to take us through till tomorrow morning. Thank you. I turned 39 yesterday. Like Jerry Lee says, 39 and holding on to anything that I can. Not really. I don't mind being 39. I got this all figured out. This midlife crisis business is bull. You know, the actuarial table says everybody croaks by 72. I mean, that's the average. So I figure I passed my midlife crisis around 36. I didn't even notice it when it happened. It just went by. I mean, you figure the three stages of life: being young, being middle-aged, and being old. Okay? According to the actuarial tables, you're middle-aged as soon as you turn 25. That's when you should have your midlife crisis. As soon as you're 48, you're an old fart. You can forget it. But, okay. This first question, why, it's lotto. It says, what do you think about God, and what do you think about Pat Robertson running for president? And then it says, P.S., when is PBS going to make the stand into a miniseries? PBS may be the only hope, because you can't do it on a network. You can't have The End of the World brought to you by Charmin Toilet Tissue. They're just not into it. As to what I think about God, I think that he's out there. A more important question is what God thinks about me. As far as what I think about Pat Robertson running for president, maybe you don't want to know. That's like asking me what I would think about, you know, if Christ had run for Emperor of Rome. I really don't think that the place for a preacher is in politics, and I don't think the place for a politician is in preaching, and I think that one person who proved that admirably was Jimmy Carter, who at least understood the difference between Caesar and God and Caesar. Maybe he wasn't such a great president, but he was okay. I mean, you know, he... Here's one that says, what do you think about Virginia Beach? Well, I saw a hotel and a hall. The outside of this place has got a, sort of an interesting construction. It looks sort of like a bunch of huge... It looks... Have any of you read The Stand? And book? All right. It looks like something Trash Can Man might burn up. You know, it's all these round things all stuck together. But I think Virginia Beach is great because they asked me to come here, so... And not everybody does that. Actually, you're very sweet to have me, and you've all sat there while I've read and run my chops. Who is my favorite comic book character? The answer is Batman. Without a doubt. Spider-Man is in second place, but what I really am sort of into is G.I. Joe. I have a word processor, which I only use for rewrites, but the brain is called a CPU. It's this great big box that sits there. And it's a little bit intimidating. So I just covered the top with G.I. Joes fighting each other. And sometimes when I'm roadblocked, I push them and go, stuff like that. And if people come in that you don't know, you get a little embarrassed or something like that. And you say, oh, I was just trying to figure out something for the kids to do when they came home from school. But for my birthday yesterday, my youngest son, who's 9, Owen, he knows the truth, and he gave me a Dr. Mindbender. Dr. Mindbender is so cool. Let's see. Let's see. Do you scare yourself sometimes? The answer is... there's always poor man's Valium for when you get too scared. Comes in bottles. Who's going to be at the Silver Bullet tonight? Well, I'm one of them. The answer is yes, I've scared myself 3 times. A lot of times, you know, it feels like you got this bulldozer inside your head. And you know that you're going to scare people, but it doesn't feel bad. It feels like, I don't want to say it feels like you're running them down, but my idea about what a really good book is when the writer, whether he's alive or dead, suddenly reaches out of the page and grabs you by the throat and says, "You're mine, baby! You belong to me! Try to get away! You want to cook some dinner for your husband? Too bad! You want to go to bed? Tough shit! You're mine! You belong to me!" And, you know, that's my idea about what it's supposed to be about. You're supposed to, you know, go out there and get them. You're not supposed to mess around and be delicate or anything like that. You're supposed to run them down. They live afterwards, you know. But I have scared myself on 3 occasions, and one of them was in the book that I've just read to you, where something extremely nasty happens in a later going, and I just passed that point in the rewrite and realized to myself that I've been dragging my feet because I knew when I got up there to the axe and the blowtorch that things were going to be nasty. And I didn't want to write that. And there was once in a book called The Shining where this kid goes into this room and there's this dead lady in a bathtub. And he keeps telling himself those things aren't there, and he turns around and, man, she's still there. I got so freaked. I couldn't believe it. So it usually comes up on you the worst in the rewrite, when you realize that you've got to face that whole nightmare again. And I guess probably the 3rd time would have been sort of toward the end of Christine, when I began to see how badly everything was going to turn out. And I really didn't like it very much because the whole thing started out to be sort of a joke. I mean, it was Happy Days gone mad. The main character, I mean, it's, you know, boy gets car, boy loses car, boy finds car. I thought it was hilarious until the kids started to run people down, and then, because sometimes they get out of control. They're like the car itself, you know, they start to run by themselves, and they don't always turn out the way that you think that they're gonna turn out. So, I'll do a couple more of these, and then I'll ask for a couple more from the audience. This is like no interaction whatsoever. I can't stand that. There's got to be some feedback, I think. What's the average and the longest hours a day you might spend writing, and does your wife ever feel left out or neglected? Well, let's see. Okay. I think the longest I ever spent in front of the typewriter was when I was working on The Talisman, which was a book that I did with Peter Straub, and I was writing this thing about the Sunlight Gardner home and all this stuff, and I looked up and realized that something like 7 hours had gone by, and that my kidneys hurt like hell, and I could barely get out of the chair, and all this other stuff. That was a weird experience. But that was the word processor, which I've since given up, because you ever see that James Bond movie where he gets hooked into the exercise machine and the thing starts to exercise him to death? Ever seen that? That's what a word processor is like. It's insanity. I've given it up. I used to write 6 pages and I was out, but with a word processor, it just keeps scrolling up and up and up. There's no end. As far as whether or not my wife feels left out and neglected, well, let's see what other questions we have here. Let's see. I don't think she does. Some of your readers can find a moral story in many of your stories. Do you intend this? And if so, do you intend your stories to be the next set of Mother Goose stories for the coming generations? Yowza. Yes. Well, what's the question? You don't remember? I can't go scrumming through that thing for an envelope. The envelope, please. This could be a mistake, folks. This could be a bad mistake. Oh, an eyeball. Oops, it's the wrong envelope. I'm not sure I can find the correct envelope. The answer is, yeah, I try to be as moral as I can because you walk a fine line in this field. There's too much exploitation. There's a lot of stuff that's just slasher stuff. There's a lot of stuff that's there. It's like the later Friday the 13th movies where you don't come. My criterion here is you don't come to see a person get away. You come to see people die. And at that point, to me, you've crossed the line into immoral territory. I have always wanted my characters to be alive, and I've always wanted the readers to like the characters and to find them good and hopeful and everything like that, and to want them to live. I got a lot of letters about the novel Cujo when the little boy, Tad Trenton, died. Well, I didn't think he was going to die. I didn't mean for him to die. I thought he was going to live. So I'd get these letters and saying, "Oh, you son of a bitch, I read 285 pages and the kid died. How could you do that?" And I would write back and say, "I don't know, he died. I was working away and I thought she was going to get him back to life and the kid just croaked. I couldn't help it." But the fact is, that's the moral ending, because kids don't always live. Sometimes kids do die. That's the truth. Sometimes they die. Sometimes they can't be saved. Well, they let him live in the movie because I think we would have been lynched from pillars at, you know, outside every movie theater in America. And also, I was curious to see what would happen if the kid did live, because that's what I had intended. But unfortunately, you know, after the movie ends, I think in the context of the movie story, the kid dies an even nastier death, because after the dog has been bitten by the rabid bat, it licks the kid's face, so I'm sure that he ended up with rabies and he died an even worse death. But that's after the end. Let's leave these. Do you have any other questions? I'll talk for a little while. Say what? Well, I hope The Stand will come out as a movie. We've been talking about it, and there's a script, and there's been a script for a long time. And I think that it would make a wonderful movie, and it's to me it doesn't look that terrible or expensive to do, and luckily a movie's been made based on The Body, which has been a success. Stand By Me, and maybe that will make a difference and unlock some of the funds. I don't know. The real problem isn't money, it's time. The movie would run probably 2¼ hours. And with their unfailing vulgarity, Hollywood has a term for that period of time between the end of one showing of a feature and the start of the next one. They call it spill and fill. And they don't like movies that run longer than 2 hours because it makes it tough in the toolies to run 3 showings a night, and they like that. So, Pet Sematary. I don't know. It was scheduled and unscheduled and rescheduled. Hollywood people are crazy. They're not like us. Wait. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Pretend this is school. Like, yeah, this guy down here in the tie and the white shirt. No, you don't have a tie on, but you got like a sunburst. Yeah, you. No, not you. The guy next to you. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you what he said. He asked me about The Stand, and whether or not it was true that it was going to be reissued or the pages had been cut from it. And the truth was that The Stand was 400 pages longer than it was when it finally appeared, and the reason that those 400 pages were cut was that it was the last book with Doubleday, and they wanted it published at $12.95. It's now $19.95, by the way, the hardcover, which shows you inflation at work. But they were determined that they were going to publish it at $12.95, and they knew that I was leaving for various reasons. So I was called into a meeting where they said, this book is 400 pages too long. Do you want to cut it, or shall we? So I said, well, maybe I better do it, because I didn't know what they would cut. So I made the best cuts that I could, but there was a lot of good stuff in those pages, and so we're going to publish it in about 2 years and reinstate the stuff that's gone. And it's real nice stuff, you know. A lot of it's real cool. Well, thank you. Complete with pictures from Bernie Wrightson and stuff like that. It's going to be a nice book. It'll be, you know, all kinds of gross stuff that you never saw before. Young lady in the purple? Say again. I'm getting a feedback. I'm getting two people at once. This lady right down here. Yes. Yeah. Well, it was to an extent, but you know, when writers write about themselves, they always lie. It's like, oh, she asked how much of myself was Bill Denbrough in It, who is the writer character in that book. And the thing about writers when they write about themselves, and I've done this a couple of times, is that you think to yourself, because you lie for a living, you know, that's your job, you think to yourself, I know what happened. This happened, and this happened. But that wasn't too interesting the way that turned out. But suppose this had happened. All right, you know. And so you change things around a little bit. The actual physical character of Bill Denbrough is based on Peter Straub. The Bill Denbrough character is bald, and while at 39 I've started to show a little snow on the top of the mountain, I don't seem to be losing too much of my hair. Some of my marbles maybe, but not too much of my hair. And Peter, one of the reasons I think that Peter stuttered, which is something that he's overcome now, was that when he was 3 years old, as the character in It, he was struck by a car and driven into a wall. He and his 7-year-old brother had been allowed to go down to the market to get ice cream cones. On their way back, a car struck Peter, driven by a drunk driver, and drove him headfirst into a brick wall, at which point his older brother picked up Peter's ice cream cone, walked back to the house, and said, "Peter's dead. He was a good brother." But Peter wasn't dead, and I showed him the manuscript and asked him, could I use him? But, you know, it's funny. For instance, in The Body, which turned into this movie, Stand By Me, almost every incident in that book actually happened, but I twisted everything around. I have leech scars in several places in my body, some of which could not be shown without really getting Pat Robertson mad. If you've seen the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. Hey, ooh. But you twist things around to fit the story. That's all. Now, this lady in the purple was asking before. Stand up and yell. Oh, she asked me if... she said The Talisman was good. Did I plan on collaborating again? Not in the near future. It was tough. Working with somebody else was tough. But it was fun, too. It's a good story. Now, let's see. It is 9:22. Fanny fatigue seems to be setting in with some people. No, they're returnables. Are you kidding me? I'll tell you what. I'll take 2 more questions. And I do want to say that generally I don't have any problem with autographing as a rule, but this would be like having a wine and cheese party for the entire Democratic Party. And once you start, you can't stop, because you can do about 40 people, and the first 40 people in line are insane collectors who have books in these wrappings and everything else, which they don't even want you to touch without gloves on. And what you end up with is 300 signed autographs and a hand that looks like one of Jerry's kids, you know. And everybody else is sort of left out, and they're not happy about it. But if you have like 2 more questions. How about this guy right up here in the white shirt? Hey! Am I a big Boston Red Sox fan? Do ursine mammals excrete in high foliage inside the woods? I'm such a big Boston Red Sox fan that I can't wait for the Red Sox-Houston World Series. And if they play those wimps, the Mets, it'll be over in 4 games, I think, because the Mets are so soft, but Houston's a scrappy little team. But well, I made a bet with a sports writer who foolishly declared they would be out by Flag Day, yes, and he ate some chicken in his skivvies. You're right. I ate mine in my tuxedo. That was one of the best days, as you know, the guy says in the song, one of the best days of my life. One more. Somebody think of something that's really... Wait! But wait, there's more. You also get the Ginsu knives and the... One other question, somebody? Yeah, right down here. Yeah, you. Creepshow 2 is in production. I wrote it, and the cameraman from Creep 1 is directing it. And Tom Savini's back on the job. It's in production now in Arizona, doing a story called Chief Woodenhead, which is about a wooden Indian that comes alive and goes on a rampage. And a couple of other stories that are finally going to be filmed in Maine. And I think it's going to be a nice picture, and I'm real proud of it. I hope it works out. The Dark Tower, the second volume of The Dark Tower has just been completed. It's called The Drawing of the Three, and I was frankly very startled by the reception of the first one, because people actually liked it, and I didn't think that they would. So, well, there's a possibility that you may be able to get it if the second one is received in good fashion. I'd like to thank you all for having come out and spent the time with me, and I appreciate it. Thank you.